Hey everyone, welcome back to Corporate Decoder, today VZs. Just filed an 8K and I am seeing a lot of listed debt. Quick note, this is not financial advice, just my take on public filings for educational purposes. The company is basically listing out all its outstanding bonds and their due dates. And it is a pretty long list. Scroll Securities registered pursuant to Section 12B of the Act for Scroll. So what we have here is a big list of Verizon Communications Incorporated's outstanding debts. Think of these like loans the company has taken out that it needs to pay back, with a specific interest rate and a date when the whole loan needs to be repaid. This isn't a new debt issuance, but rather a public reporting of what they already have. It is part of their regular filings to keep investors informed about their financial obligations. Scroll common stock, par value $0.1 signed Scroll. You can see their common stock is listed on both the New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq Global Select Market. This is pretty standard for a company of Verizon's size. Scroll 1.375% notes due 2026 by Scroll. Now let's look at the actual debt. We're talking about notes that are basically bonds. For example, they have notes that are due in 2026 with an interest rate of 1.375%. Scroll 0.875% notes due 2027 Scroll. Then there are notes due in 2027 with a lower interest rate of 0.875%. Scroll 1.375% notes due 2028. Sorry, Scroll. They also have notes due in 2028 with a 1.375% interest rate. Scroll 1.125% notes due 2028. Scroll and more notes due in 2028. But this time with a 1.125% interest rate. Scroll 2.350% fixed rate notes due 2028. Scroll. Here is another set due in 2028. These are fixed rate notes with a 2.350% interest rate. Scroll 1.875% notes due 2029. Scroll moving on, they have notes due in 2029 with a 1.875% interest rate. Scroll 0.375% notes due 2029 Scroll, and some more notes due in 2029, surprisingly with a very low interest rate of 0.375%. Scroll 1.250% notes due 2030 Scroll. Now we get into the 2030s. Here are notes due in 2030 with a 1.250% interest rate. Scroll 1.875% notes due 2030 Scroll, another set of notes due in 2030, this time at 1.875%, Scroll 4.250% notes due 2030 Scroll, and a higher interest rate for notes due in 2030 at 4.250%, Scroll 2.625% notes due 2031. Scroll continuing on. Notes due in 2031 with a 2.625% interest rate, Scroll 2.500% notes due 2031 Scroll. Then notes due in 2031 at 2.500%, Scroll 3.000% fixed rate notes due 2031 Scroll, and fixed rate notes due in 2031 at 3.000%. Scroll 0.875% notes due 2032 Scroll jumping to 2032. They have notes with a 0.875% interest rate. Scroll 0.750% notes due 2032 Scroll even lower. Notes due in 2032 at 0.750%. Scroll 3.500% notes due 2032 Scroll, and some due in 2032 with a higher rate of 3.500%. Scroll 3.250% notes due 2032 Fine Scroll, also due in 2032 notes at 3.250%. Scroll 1.300% notes due 2033. Scroll moving to 2033, notes at 1.300%. Scroll 4.750% notes due 2034. Scroll now, we see some higher rates again for notes due in 2034 at 4.750%. Scroll 3.125% notes due 2035 Scroll. For notes due in 2035, they have them at 3.125%. Scroll 1.125% notes due 2035 Scroll, and more notes in 2035 at a lower 1.125%. Scroll 3.375% notes due 2036, Scroll into 2036, Scroll into 2036, notes at 3.375%. Scroll 3.750% notes due 2036 Scroll, and notes in 2036 at 3.750%. Scroll 3.750% notes due 2037 Scroll. For 2037, Scroll for 2037, they have notes at 3.750%. Scroll 2.875% notes due 2038. Scroll looking at 2038 notes with a 2.875% interest rate. Scroll 1.875% notes due 2038 Scroll, and more notes in 2038 at 1.875%. Scroll 1.500% notes due 2039 Scroll. For 2039, notes at 1.500%. Scroll 3.500% fixed rate notes due 2039 Scroll, and fixed rate notes due in 2039 at 3.500%. Scroll 1.850% notes due 2040 forward. Scroll moving to 2040. Notes at 1.850%. Scroll 3.850%. Fixed rate notes due 2041 SUNN. Scroll then fixed rate notes due in 2041 at 3.850%. Scroll 3.9962% fixed. To fixed rate junior subordinated notes due 2056 scroll. And we have notes stretching way out to 2056 with a rate of 3.9962%. These are junior subordinated notes, which means they are higher risk than the senior notes. Scroll 5.7420% fixed to 0%. Fixed rate junior subordinated notes due 2056. 5 scroll also due in 2056. Other junior subordinated notes with a much higher rate of 5.7420%. Scroll 4.2462% fixed to fixed rate junior subordinated notes due 2056 via scroll, and another set of junior subordinated notes due in 2056 at 4.2462%, scroll 5.7427% fixed, to fixed rate junior subordinated notes due 2056. 5 scroll finally for 2056. More junior subordinated notes at a very similar rate of 5.7427%. Scroll press release dated the 2nd of June 2026 issued by Verizon. Scroll the main event in this filing is an attached press release. While the 8K itself lists out all this debt, the press release is where the actual news is likely contained. The filing just tells us that this press release dated the 2nd of June 2026 is being attached. Since we don't have the content of the press release directly in this filing text, we have to assume it is the significant event they are reporting. Scroll exhibit number sigly and 8K reports a material event, given that the only other attached exhibit is the interactive data file. The press release is the substantive information. Without knowing the exact details of the press release, speculating on the exact impact is difficult. However, the sheer volume of listed debt items, even if they are just existing obligations, shows that Verizon has a significant amount of financing. Looking at this from a broad perspective, Verizon, like many large telecommunication companies, uses debt to finance its operations and growth. The variety of interest rates and repayment dates show a diverse debt structure. The existence of junior subordinated notes, especially those with higher interest rates indicating higher risk, is something to keep an eye on. However, the fact these are listed in an 8K without a specific material event announcement tied to them suggests this is more of a routine update on their debt portfolio, rather than a new problem or a major new borrowing. The key takeaway is that Verizon has a substantial amount of debt across many different maturities and interest rates. While the filing itself is quite technical, focusing on the listed notes gives us a glimpse into their financial structure. The real story, as always with these 8K filings that point to an exhibit, lies within that press release. Oh, and the research tools I actually use are linked in the description. They help keep this channel going. That is my take. Stay decoded. If this analysis was valuable, hitting that like button really helps. And subscribe for more deep dives.